I'm Nicola Talent and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. Curtis Warren, right?
Yeah.
I was actually doing an interview with Peter Walsh near the beginning of the Crime World startup,
the
right?
first, I think,
it was number 20, but it was
it?
it's 2024, I think it was.
Yeah.
Peter Walsh had written this book called Cocky. Curtis Cocky Warren was his nickname, the Cocky Watchman.
Yeah.
And I asked him about, what is his thing, because they all have a thing.
Yeah.
We all probably do.
Yeah.
We all have one thing that's sort of maybe, and these drug guys, it's either they use drugs themselves, they're into their drink, they're, smokers, they're socializers, they're whatever. And no, he's none of those things. But it was like, talk about an insight into him. He said what his thing is the women.
Oh, the women. Yeah.
And, you can absolutely see that's come back to bite him in the ass, hasn't it?
Well, what did you think of? So Curtis Warren has this week been arrested in the home of a former prison officer that he had an affair with while in prison. Yeah. She was ultimately sentenced to 2 years in prison, was it, for misconduct in public office?
She was working in a very high security prison.
Yeah.
Frankland prison, where he had been serving sentence, and they got romantically involved.
Well, what did you think of the evidence, Nicola, knowing you're, sometimes don't enjoy these details, where there was a hole cut in her prison trousers and that was discussed in court?
What was that for, Niall?
I don't know, Nicola. I was just going to ask you.
Why would you want to cut a hole in your prison trousers? Now, come on now, you brought it up.
No, I'm
going to kick that ball right back into your court there now.
Well, it was discussed. I thought it was funny. The judge, I think, during her sentencing said, what other purpose could there be for cutting a hole in your prison uniform other than the purpose of romance?
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
And, of course, look, Curtis Warren, I've spoken to Eamon Dillon before about these romances that start in prisons. Like, prisons are just a different ecosystem to the one we live in.
Yeah.
But all those emotions and feelings and all that exist in them.
Yeah.
And regularly prisoners and, warders
can
start having relationships, or prisoners with one another sometimes, that kind of thing. But we won't go there. We definitely won't go there, actually. But yeah, like it's not totally unusual, but the idea that he has now gone and likely to go back to jail because of this.
Yeah, look, it shows he's a committed man. They're hard to find in the modern world.
So how long ago was this relationship with her that she cut her hole in her pants?
Well, she was convicted in 2020. So he was obviously, Curtis Warren, famously, I think, was the first ever drug dealer to make the rich list in the UK back in the 1990s. He was shot out of nothing and became the absolute biggest cocaine dealer in Britain. And ultimately then he got out and ended up in Jersey again, wasn't it? And he served a lengthy sentence.
He got out of prison and he went back to Jersey and was caught trying to import drugs again, went back into prison. And then because he was on the rich list and he was believed to be worth 300 million or whatever it was, he was given one of these bills by the proceeds of crime. And the bill was for 198 million he owes to the UK Exchequer, but he couldn't pay it. So they gave him another 10 years. So he was in jail. And it was obviously during this sentence that the romance developed. With the prison warder.
Yes.
So, but I suppose who else are you going to romance with?
Exactly. So
there's not much choice. I'd be feeling a bit insecure if I was her, I think.
Now that he's out?
No, not that he's out. But if you were in a relationship, if you were in prison and you were in a relationship, would you believe it all was true? Or would you think that it's only because there is nobody else?
I thought, this is 35 years since...
It's like Love Island.
35 years since Seinfeld, the programme?
Yeah.
And there's a part in that where George Costanza starts going out with a prisoner and a female prisoner serving life. And he says to Jerry, "It's brilliant. You know exactly where she is at all times."
You see, this is it.
So I suppose she knew exactly where he was.
She would have known exactly where he was, but would she have thought she was
The
being
competition
used?
would have been really, really small.
Yeah. I just said to Dara a minute ago, we should have done a Love Island commentary, the two of us, on this. I am actually watching Love Island.
Yeah.
So it's all about, and you're still talking about Seinfeld. It just sort of shows
my pop culture references are dated.
A little bit dated, I hate to tell you, a little bit. But they talk about the connections, and they're always talking about and examining all these kind of relationships they're having and this, that and the other. Now they're all about 19 or something. Yeah. But yeah, that's why that's in my head, that I would be going, is he just choosing me because I'm the only one here? But obviously, no, he followed up and met her on the outside.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the difference, I mean, it's an incredible story, the Curtis Warren story, in fairness, and absolutely, you know, reads exactly like an incredible gangster film, really. He's arrested this week. The reason he's arrested is for breaching what's called a serious crime order. So basically, even though he's released and served his time, because of the legislation that exists in the UK, the state is entitled to put these really severe restrictions on him, which include things to do with travel. He's not allowed to have a bank account, I think, with more than €1,000 in it. He's not allowed to use WhatsApp. I'm not sure if there's very heavy restrictions on mobile phones. I don't know if he has to register them. So these don't exist in Ireland, but there's
called the NCA, the National Crime Agency Crime Watch List.
Yeah.
And he was put on that even before he was released the last time, in the kind of the build up to his release, because the fear was he was going to go straight back into the game.
Yeah.
I mean, and where's all this money that he was supposed to have owned? At 1.3 million.
Yeah.
None of it has shown up. But yeah, that is new and draconian legislation that is brought in an effort to kind of, I suppose, as part of this war on crime, war on drugs, which nobody seems to be winning. But it's in an effort to kind of stop in their tracks these guys that are kind of, there's an inevitability to them going back into the drugs game, and going back at a very high level because of the contacts they still have.
So he's,
but easy to breach, in fairness.
Yeah, and he's obviously arrested. He's not being convicted. So I think he had
the relationship with the warden part of the
No, I don't think it's to do with unauthorized use of phones, vehicles, and bank accounts, and travel is what he's been arrested of. So the fact that he's there, his solicitor actually came out and said he's entitled to be there. He doesn't have that restriction. He's allowed. He's living up in the north of. She's living up in the north of England, and he's living with her. And
living with her.
Well, that's what it said.
And she's still working as a warden,
but not as a warden, no, because she's being convicted. And
yeah.
So I mean, this is the restrictions. He's 50 years. Must be love. Is he 60 years old now? I think it is.
Certainly 59. Maybe he's turned 60 now, but
I think they're describing him as 60. So, I mean, he would have began. He was famously, I think, linked to this. It was at the time, I think it was 1,000 kilos of cocaine was found. Curtis Warren had been involved in armed robbery. He served a prison sentence for armed robbery in the 80s. He'd come out of prison, and at the time of the explosion of the drug scene, which again we've spoken about. But unlike, I suppose, his contemporaries, he was in his 20s at this stage. He had made contact with the Cali cartel, was who it was, directly. He had this incredible ambition to cut out all the middlemen after becoming involved in the drug trade locally, and had struck a deal directly with the Cali cartel. He had an associate fly over there, stay with one of the leaders, and they they were smuggling then huge amounts of cocaine, hundreds of kilos of cocaine into the UK, in these very elaborate concrete kind of, I think it was piping. Ingots, was it? Yeah. So, I mean, I think they got a couple through, did they? And then eventually they were caught. They attempted to convict him of that, I think, and he walked. He
didn't have enough evidence. He's Liverpool, right? Yeah. And Liverpool, he would be seen, sort of his legacy is seen as one of those people who kind of helped turn Liverpool into one of the capitals of drug trafficking in Europe.
Yeah.
It's a port, obviously. It's very similar to Dublin, actually. A lot of connections between Dublin criminals and Liverpool criminals. But Curtis Warren, he was a mixed race youth from a place called Toxteth, which was extremely poor part of Liverpool. And he sort of was becoming an adult in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. And the area he was from was really poor. There was no employment opportunities. There was a lot of racial tensions, and it was the scene of these horrific riots.
There was.
And in 1981, I think in particular, and it's still seen as one of the worst riots that's ever been happened in the UK. So that's kind of where he came from, I suppose. And that early 80s, Liverpool was on the brink of a heroin epidemic in the same way as Dublin was at the same time. We've quite tally, and I suppose 2 ports and all the rest of it. And he got involved in petty crime. Earliest conviction was when he was 12. Went in and out of some of those sort of, youth offender institutes and got into armed robbery. But he seems to have made some connections in Liverpool with an older sort of mentor-style criminal that is sort of never been named. But I think any of the crime journalists know who this individual is. Individual still alive, would have been close to him, would have mentored him, and would have put up the money to move him from a street dealer to a high-end wholesaler. Because, of course, you need a couple of $100,000 to start you out in the drugs business, because you have to buy your first and hopefully get your first one through. But they went from, they kind of realised he was big and important, was dealing with the Cali cartel. They went from that time and they didn't have enough evidence to convict him. So they kind of, in the background, the police really put a lot of efforts into dismantling his gang. So he moved to Holland.
Yeah, and like, I suppose, some of his Irish contemporaries who also ended up in Holland at the same time. And of course, there was many connections there between Warren and Irish figures, Christy Kinahan and others. But like some of the Kinahan associates, like John Cunningham, he was caught ultimately on his phones, really, wasn't he? In Holland.
Yeah.
I don't know, at that point, was that kind of evidence being presented in UK courts? But certainly
you could use the fact that the phone calls had been made in the UK, but you couldn't use the contents of them, whereas in the Netherlands, and he seemed to not understand this, you could use both the fact the phone calls plus the contents of it. And they recorded them. Actually, initially the Dutch were approached by the I think it was then SOCA, the Serious Organised Crime Agency in the UK, and they were approached and asked to, told that this is a massive drug dealer. He's living in Amsterdam. And they sort of said, well, he might be a massive, but we have loads of these guys. We've loads of Curtis Warrens. We don't have time or efforts. They were actually putting their efforts into drug gangs who were shooting at one another, who were the usual sort of situation. And it did take them a while, actually. So Curtis Warren got himself well set up in the Netherlands, and I think was doing his business. The Cali cartel had representatives in Europe at that point, which shows how they saw that market as being so important, such a growth market, that they were starting to send over their representatives. And there's plenty of others they were doing business with directly, likely all the way back then with Christy Kinahan too, and with Scottish drug dealers and all the rest of it. But interestingly, his time in the Netherlands, he settled there with a couple of his gang members and sort of settled into life
in a kind of suburban part, I think.
Suburban part, but he was a regular user of brothels.
Yes, yeah.
Because as with his others, and of course the sort of the red light district in Amsterdam is very famous. Apparently, it was somewhere that he could go to have that sort of element of his day-to-day life looked after, but he didn't have to worry about bringing somebody into his world, because I suppose it's not, if you're working as a drug dealer and you're dealing with the Colombians and you're, back then, it probably wasn't the best idea to have a girlfriend tagging along. So it was perfect for him.
Yeah.
I wonder, does that bother his warder lady?
I don't know.
Involved in that kind of carry on.
But he was a load of this, of course, was caught on those wiretaps, wasn't it? Describing going to brothels and describing the ladies that he came across. And then as well, he seems to have been undone a bit by gossiping asking what was going on back in Liverpool, and
Yeah.
seems to have wanted daily updates about the local gossip on the street, and it was really unguarded, I think, wasn't it? All the stuff like
It was amazingly, even though he'd complain about the others using their
Yeah.
phones, he was actually like on the phone complaining about others using their phones. But he was apart from the gossip and the prostitution and all that, he was also doing deals with the Colombians, with the Turks for the heroin. He was doing everything.
Yeah.
Like Curtis Warren wasn't somebody, even though he'd come out of the sort of the Toxteth area, which would later be like ultimately destroyed in the same way as large parts of Dublin were by heroin. He was still quite happy to deal that.
Yeah.
He didn't care. He wasn't one of these dealers that wasn't going to go near heroin because what it did. He just anything to make money. And he built all this money. But he was doing those deals, and they were able to use the information to follow the shipments to try and crack down on them. But, the Netherlands, it's such an odd place. And I don't know whether this is still the situation there, but it was then. So you can bug somebody's phones for 6 months without telling them. But after 6 months, you have to go to them and go, sorry, we're bugging your phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean...
Don't know. I mean, it's the sort of civil liberties. I
Yeah.
don't know.
I suppose you know, if you're going to get anything, the argument would be that you'd have, if they are up to no good, the kind of no good that you'd have applied for your warrants to tap the phones with, you'd have found out at that
in
stage.
all countries, I suppose, in the US, that then they used to have they could only listen to 40 seconds of a conversation on the phone until they found out if it's possibly criminally related. And then they'd have to hang up if the mafia
They ever hang up.
Well, that it couldn't be used then in court if they hadn't.
Do any of us follow rules?
I don't know. Well, yeah.
You do.
Some of us do.
But anyway, he was, eventually he was caught.
Yeah.
And he was jailed.
Yeah.
And he was sent to Vught prison, which is this big, high security prison, where Ridwan Taghi is today.
Yeah.
I think it's the Netherlands' only particularly nasty prison. And behind bars there, he killed a Turkish inmate.
Yeah. I mean, he'd been a bouncer, Curtis Warren, I think, was.
Yeah.
After he and he was a street fighter and very much into his fitness at one point. And he'd become involved in a confrontation behind bars, wasn't it? And he punched him and the guy died. And then I think as well, as you said, he'd become a celebrity then at that point, hadn't he? He'd become the first real, if you look back at the Craze and all those guys, he'd become that first new generation of celebrity criminal in the UK. And I think that certainly inspired him to continue after him and look at his assets.
And where they came up with that crazy figure. The investigation we're talking about that led to his sentence was called Operation Crayfish. And the Dutch police, while also listening to the phones, Curtis Warren's crew used to like to fish.
Yeah.
And the cops used to go up alongside them and try and fish with them and listen in.
Right.
Sounds kind of quaint, doesn't it? But one of the things that was discovered during Operation Crayfish on a completely different continent, or country rather, and something which was another first for Curtis Warren, because I suppose he tried to bring in the biggest heroin shipment into the UK, the biggest cocaine shipment, but he also, they discovered, had the highest ranking cop in his pocket.
Yeah.
So while he was on the phones and while the Dutch were listening in, something happened, a contact of his or a colleague of his, something nonsensical, like there was a row in a pub.
Yes.
And this guy was arrested and there was going to be a trial.
Yeah.
Or certainly it looked as if he was going to be before the courts, but it was on like an assault charge or something.
Yeah.
So Warren actually picked up the phone and was heard on the phone calling and getting through to the deputy head of Merseyside Drug Squad, a DCI called Elmore Davies. And he spoke to Davies and he said to him the predicament that this friend of his was in, and is there any chance you could let me know what's happening here or whatever.
Yeah.
Polite enough conversation. And it was basically discovered that Davies was on the payroll.
Yeah.
But like, he was at the end of his career, this guy.
Yeah.
Really decorated, really high-ranking police officer who had been fighting crime his whole life.
Yeah.
And was pocketing 20 grand.
Yeah, I mean,
for this downfall, like,
yeah, I
which
mean,
was spectacular.
and I think there was, I think that was a real shock moment for them, wasn't it? In the UK, that people had been corrupted to that level,
Yeah.
and that there was able. I mean, I think that case he did it sort of appeared that case could be made go away. I think was what it was, but yeah, that was an undoing, and I think in the wiretap it was really something over nothing, wasn't it? It was a son of some
It
associate
was something
of
that
his.
happened in a nightclub,
Yeah.
and there was allegations of an attempted murder or something
Yeah.
like this. But okay, that's a pretty big charge. I suppose it was going to come
Yeah.
to that. But it wasn't even for him. It was for an associate of his. And of course, everybody obviously knew that he had a cop in his pocket and could...
Yeah, and he was also doing what a lot of these criminals end up doing, which is taking on that kind of godfather role where he was resolving these disputes and settling things, and it was all a bit ego-driven of him being the big man who could sort everything out for everybody.
It's interesting because at the same time, so he's in prison by, I think he ultimately got 12 years sentence. And so he's in prison. He was released in 2007. So he's in prison towards the end of the late 1990s, excuse me. By the early 2000s, down on the Costa, there's two brothers that are working for him who get in tow with the Kinahans, the kind of the young guns of the Kinahan organisation, including Daniel Kinahan, and they start working together. And Curtis's crew introduce the Kinahans to a Moroccan supplier who not only guarantees to be able to supply with cannabis, but guarantees the landing of the cannabis on a beach. And they work together, and they
pool resources.
They pool the resources. They get a load of cannabis over. They've sort of taken these cars to pieces so as they can load the cannabis bales into these cars on the beaches, and they drive them to a warehouse they have in operation up away from the coast a bit, and they then break it up and move that on further up through Spain, onwards into Europe, the UK market, and indeed over to Ireland. But what's interesting about that is, in that timeline, when you look at it, so John Cunningham, who was Christy Kinahan's business partner at that stage, he's also the focus of a Dutch police investigation and is jailed.
Yeah.
Because he's caught with drugs, red-handed with drugs and weapons. And he goes to Vught prison as well.
Yeah.
So whether or not there was a connection between Kinahan Senior and Curtis Warren before that, you can be under no illusion. But they would have, the two English speakers would have got together, rubbed shoulders behind bars.
Yeah.
Now, that's just a little aside in a way, but it just shows that every story we talk about, no matter who's involved, the Kinahans are never far from it, really, are they? He was released from that jail in 2007. And at that point, he moved to Jersey.
Yeah.
But it wasn't long before he was caught again trying to organise a drug importation to the island.
Yeah, it seems that he was almost caught straight away, does it?
Yes.
He doesn't seem to have been particularly successful that second go around. He seems to have been a bit desperate for money, and he was kind of in a way set up, wasn't it? It was the police were in there at the very, very start. And he
certainly gets nowhere with any of it.
He gets nowhere, and he seems to have been caught almost on his first big effort to land. It was a lot of cannabis, wasn't it, into Jersey?
Jersey.
Seems to have literally been almost, as soon as he's back in it, he's caught. And he gets a big long sentence then. I think it was 13 years at that point. I mean, it was still a couple of £1 million worth of cannabis, I think, but it wasn't.
It's because of the previous sentence, of course. That he had
but the scale, and it wasn't as if he was back making millions and back to the very pinnacle of the drugs business. He's a much smaller scale and caught really, really quickly.
And like the UK really went for Curtis Warren, didn't they?
Yeah.
I mean, he really pissed them off, because not only did they go from with the cannabis and he gets a hefty sentence for that, for cannabis, but by 2013 he's asked to pay up this, as aforementioned, almost 200 million, which he has been deemed to have made from the proceeds of crime. And he doesn't. How the hell do you pay 200 million no matter what you've ever made? Can't pay it, doesn't want to pay it, whatever. So he gets another 10 years to serve.
Yeah.
Now, it's during this time that he has the relationship with the prison officer. But, you know, while he's one of these, like, everybody knows the name Curtis Warren, anybody interested in organised crime knows the name, he's legendary within his own lifetime as being one of Liverpool's first big drug lords. But he's really been a pretty shit criminal, actually.
Yeah, but he's got caught a lot.
Hasn't he?
Well, he spent the vast majority of his adult life in prison now.
Prison.
There was an interesting bit actually in one of the UK papers this week after he was arrested. They were obviously up there and going around and grabbing neighbours. Did you ever see him around? And a couple of them said they saw him here and there. And one guy did a whole little bit about how he recognised him as Curtis Warren. And Curtis Warren was trying to get a bit of building work, putting in kitchens. He was going around with a few Liverpool lads and trying to get a bit of work, and he's recognised him, said, "Can I take a picture?" And he said, no, I can't take any pictures with anybody because of the NCA will come after me. I'm barred from that. And he was saying, like, I really need a job because I need to show him I'm earning legitimately and all of this. And, he said, he just looked like a regular, he looked a bit down, like, didn't look like he was dressed well or anything. He was just with a load of Liverpool lads, just looked like a bunch of regular Liverpool builders looking for a bit of work.
And certainly the house he was living in, the video courses on the NCA have very proudly released at the NCA. But it's so ordinary. Like, I mean, it's, for somebody that was on the rich list, 300 million, like the falls are catastrophic, aren't they?
The falls are catastrophic. Now,
the high is so high.
Yeah.
And the low is just...
But he's certainly in a position, and we don't have this here, where any display of wealth, I mean, going on holidays to Spain or anything like that will put him at risk of going back into prison for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
Like, he's being monitored at every level. It's harsh, isn't it? It's a tough.
No, it is. And like, again, we come back to it, like, is it worth it? You're 60 years of age, you've spent most of your adult life in prison. Your relationship is with the prison warder, who was the only female in your vicinity for a long time. And you're trying to grab a little bit of work, make a few £100 and you can't even, if you do have this fast
phone. I mean, I think you can own a phone, is it? But there's certainly...
I mean, how could you not break all those regulations?
I don't know. So it's,
You're not allowed to use the internet, you're not allowed to use a phone. You can't have more than £1,000
in your bank account.
In your bank account.
As far as I know, yeah.
Or your cash on you. I think it's cash. That's something to do with cash. Oh no, you're right. It's your assets. They can't hold any more than 1,000 in assets.
Yeah.
So if you make any more, if legitimately you have to give it to somebody.
I think, and that's taken and subtracted.
You're not allowed. This one makes sense. You're not allowed to be involved in the import or export business.
Yeah.
But they are draconian, and it does seem like the UK really pushed everything down on Curtis Warren.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one thing you could probably say about him.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
Yeah.
He's no rat.
No, he's no rat, no. And there's another thing. It's not good for these criminals to appear on rich lists or anything like it. I mean, Pablo Escobar, of course, famously appeared on the Forbes rich list, wasn't it? And some of these things are the downfall of these guys, because it can't be tolerated in a normal society that you have a criminal on the rich list,
Yeah, yeah. Well, he didn't go to Dubai anyway.
No.
And, you'd wonder, has he still, like everybody, is he washed up now?
Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, the world moves on really quickly. That world does how many of the people he grew up with, trusted and was loyal to, and were loyal to him, how many of them are left?
Yeah.
Certainly there was a falling out, I think, within his gang, wasn't there? And that some of that maybe ongoing to this day over a murder. So does he have the context, or does he, certainly he'd be paranoid about trying to make new ones. And that life can pass you by,
And I wonder, this time around, will his woman wait for him?
Well, she's done so far.
She has. Yeah. There's no...
There's an odd sock for every shoe.
There is. No, there is. There just is.
Yeah.
Never a truer word has been said.
Yeah.
So, poor Curtis.
Poor Curtis.
Yeah. He's fallen again.
Oh.
Okay, Niall, thank you.
Thanks, Nicola.